On January 10th, Australia's lone surviving Cardinal of the Catholic Church, Secretary for the Economy of the whole Vatican City, and most importantly, former Victorian private school boy, George Pell, died. He was Australia's highest-ranking member of the Catholic Church, so his death was a pretty big deal. His death was fairly mundane. He had hip surgery in Rome and died aged 81. But now that almost 16 seconds have passed, thanks YouTube, I can now safely say that George Pell was also an accused diddler of boys of the underage kind. He was convicted on 2 counts, I'll get into that later, but those convictions went to the High Court and were quashed, unexpectedly. It wasn't even in the news until the convictions were overturned. At the very least, it's been confirmed that he did ignore rampant sex abuses of children and never punished anyone under his wing. I'm not going to get into what everyone thought of George Pell or what his legacy was before diddling, because he became the Archbishop of Melbourne and Sydney before I was even born. But he seemed to be pretty popular in Australia because at the time he was like the only Australian priest who had any kind of contact with the Vatican. Oh, hang on, a quick edit here. There are actually 2 other cardinals in Australia. There's Cardinal Clancy and Cardinal Cassidy. But Pell was the only Australian who actually got to vote in the 2005 papal conclave, which is a thing the Vatican does to elect a new pope. So I'd say George Pell was a pretty big deal, especially in Australia. He received the Order of Australia in 2005, which is like Australia's version of the Presidential Medal of Freedom in the US. So yeah, out of every religious person in Australia, he was the top dog. Now, certain illegal activities involving people, especially boys of the underage variety, were actually pretty common, and definitely more of an open secret before George Pell became, well, the Archbishop of both Melbourne and Sydney. Even at the time, abuses amongst the archdiocese were, technically still an open secret. But of course, to keep the Catholic train running here in Australia, and something that actually surprised me as I was researching Pell, was that he was sort of the first bishop to actually recognise that abuses were going on in the Catholic Church. He was the first one to set up some kind of investigation committee into, these sorts of abuses in the Catholic Church, which he called the Melbourne Response. Look, the details surrounding Pell's Melbourne Response, how it actually operated, is written in a confusing mess of Catholicese. Pell says his whole idea around the Melbourne Response was to encourage victims of, abuse to come forward, and that all cases will be held independently from the Catholic Church. This sounds all well and good, right? I mean, the Catholic Church prides itself on abstinence of any form of, stuff until marriage. And under Australian law, nobody under 18 can get married. Hint, hint. From what I can gather, Pell must have actually been, surprised at the amount of abuse that was going on in the Catholic Church amongst pretty much anyone under his wing, because the first independent commissioner investigated 351 different complaints about, priests in Australia's Catholic churches. He upheld convictions for 97% of them, which is around 341 out of the 351. However, Pell's Melbourne Response might not have been adequate, and at some point he must have realised that there was a lot of abuse going on in the Catholic Church, and any more accusations and convictions can pretty much make anyone stop believing in the Catholic Church, and he'd be out of a job, and everything he devoted his life towards would be all for naught. One of the reasons why Cardinal Pell ignored and covered up abuses was that the Melbourne Response was set to give each victim, at least each confirmed victim, $50,000 in cash as compensation for being abused by any member of the clergy. Now, considering the fact that the Melbourne Response's first investigator confirmed almost 400 individual cases of abuse, if the Melbourne Response did pay each victim around $50,000, they'd have to give out at least $20 million. Maybe Pell set up the response as some kind of official measure to say that, hey, abuse in the Catholic Church is overblown. We'll give each individual $50,000. It's nothing. There's kind of a problem with laws around the Catholic Church in Australia, though, or at least there was when Pell was in power. In 2007, an altar boy named John Ellis sued the Archdiocese of Sydney, claiming they were responsible for the abuse he suffered when he was an altar boy. But you see, organisations like religions aren't exactly a legal entity to sue. I'm not sure why you can't sue religions, and maybe it's because they're non-profit or something. I tried researching it, but the problem was Ellis couldn't actually sue the Archdiocese of Sydney. Because they were a religious organisation, he had no grounds to sue them. It might also have something to do with the fact that religions are legally not accountable for anything an individual member of the clergy does. I mean, sure, Ellis could have just sued the individuals he accused of abusing individually, but no, he actually sued the whole Archdiocese of Sydney because they covered up his abuse. And since there was no legal entity that Ellis could have sued, Pell used this loophole to prevent paying out victims of abuse under Australia's Catholic Church. From what I've read, at least since 2018, the Ellis defence cannot be used to prevent anyone from suing a religious organisation. The other half of the controversy around Pell came in 2017 when he was charged with abuse himself. Pell had been under investigation for abuse himself, dating back to 2013, and 4 years later, he was officially charged. I'm not sure how many counts he was charged for. It was more than one. Either way, his case was split into 2 separate trials, one for any kind of abuse that Pell was accused of doing while he was doing his religious duties in the Catholic Church, and a separate trial for when he was off duty, so to speak, at a public swimming pool, a public space full of half-naked children. Nah, Pell just wanted a dip in a public pool, because public pools in Australia are so much better than the private pools that the Vatican could ever build, apparently. Now, the public swimming pool charge was dropped because it happened in the 70s and there wasn't enough evidence left anymore. But as far as the trial in the cathedral goes, he was found guilty on 5 counts. For 2 counts of abuse, he was of underage boys. Pell was somehow only sentenced to 6 years, with a non-parole period of 3 years and 8 months. Sure, he was also forced to register as a sex offender, but looking at court cases of YouTubers who did the CP, and not any actual abuse, they all got around 10 years. Which, fair enough. They did support the abuse and made no attempts to save the kids from abuse or anything. But 6 years? That's shockingly low for 2 counts of abuse of an underage person from a person in a position of power where the victims had no chance of fighting back. And the amount of days he actually served in jail? 404, just over a year. And why did he serve only a year? He got acquitted of all charges. Okay, rape is notoriously hard to prove. I get it. But because there was a little bit of doubt in the evidence, and the fact that Cardinal Pell was the highest ranking member of the Catholic Church in Australia, all 7 justices assigned to the case of Pell unanimously acquitted him. Talk about leeway, am I right? Well, even if he didn't abuse anyone himself, His Eminence Cardinal Pell did at least cover up cases of child abuse in the Catholic Church in Australia. Because going back to the Melbourne response, there was no way Pell would have paid each victim $50,000. Because again, Pell must have realised just how much abuse was going on in the Catholic Church. And there also might have been an investigation into how the Catholic Church gets its money anyway. I know they get most of their money from the real estate that the churches, actually sit on and where they're built. And the Catholic churches, well, the main ones of Melbourne and Sydney are like smack bang in the CBD and generate a lot of wealth. It's highly unlikely that that's exclusively how the Catholic Church of Australia gets their money. There's got to be some individual donors, right? I mean, if Kim Jong-un was found to have donated to the Catholic Church of Australia for some reason, the Catholic Church of Australia might not be able to pay for their second visit to the Vatican this month. 5-star hotels, beautiful centuries-old Vatican swimming pools and all. Now, because Cardinal Pell was such a respected figure in the whole, Christian scene in Australia, the High Courts of Victoria enacted a publication ban of the whole trial. Why? Well, it's probably to prevent any kind of powerful media corporation to, sway the jury in one direction or another. But after the conviction, the Victorian police charged 27 different media publications for breaking the gag order on reporting on the trial of Cardinal Pell while it was still going. Just for the record, no gag orders against reporting on trials was ever enacted in other high-profile criminal cases in Australia, like the Port Arthur massacre, the bodies in the barrels, or even the trial of former police detective Roger Rogerson. Like, damn, not even a member of the justice system could get any kind of protection from the justice system. But Cardinal Pell was the one exception, and he was the only one who got acquitted of all charges. But enough about that. It's time for me to say the final word to His Eminence, the former Cardinal George Pell. And my final word is, I'll hand it off to the big man in the sky. I'm sure he's got a lot of questions for you. Grab some tea and coffee while you're at it. You're gonna need to be awake for a little while longer.